Hey everyone, my name's Dom, welcome to the channel. Today I've got a review of another upcoming fantasy release for you. This one is the Maleficent 7 by Cameron Johnston. So if you haven't already done so, give the like and subscribe buttons a little tickle, and then let's go and find out a little bit more. So this is another book that I've received through NetGalley because it's not released until the 10th of August, so there's another couple of weeks to wait if you want to get your hands on a physical copy of this through normal means. The Maleficent 7 itself is a retelling of the classic Gathering of Heroes style story, first really seen in Kurosawa's The Seven Samurai. This story has been retold in many forms, from the Magnificent Seven, where we've got gunslingers in a western setting. The Avengers is a type of Gathering of Heroes story as well, even down to Pixar's A Bug's Life, which takes this same trope and puts it into a new setting. So this is the first time that I've seen it in a fantasy setting, and there's a lot of little twists that have been put in here, so I was quite interested to see how it all pulls together. This is one that's been on my radar for a little while, since I first saw the cover reveal a couple of months ago, and I thought it looked pretty cool. The story intrigued me as well, so I thought let's get a copy and see how well it works out. So the story itself, in a nutshell, is very simple. It's the gathering of 7 heroes to defend the good from the bad. In the Maleficent 7, and the title kind of gives it away a little bit, it's not quite that simple. So we start off the book with a kind of prologue set 40 years ahead of the main storyline. We are outside of a town or city which is under siege from this dread army who have basically conquered the rest of the world before them. This army is led by a demonologist by the name of Black Heron. She's got a number of generals who are all equally as vile and evil, and they're basically surrounding this city, and the next morning they're going to begin their assault, take it over, and that will be the last bastion holding out against this army, overrun, and Black Heron and her army will rule the world. Now overnight, Black Heron disappears. The generals don't know why, she doesn't tell them anything, she's just gone, and that's basically the beginning of the end for this army. They're unsuccessful in taking over this final city. They're therefore unsuccessful in gaining complete rule over this world. The army begins to break apart, and over time things kind of start going a bit back to normal, with all of these conquered towns and cities no longer being under the rule of Black Heron's army. So then fast forward 40 years and there's a new threat on the horizon. Black Heron's army has completely disappeared, it's been decimated. The last dregs of the army have been hunted down and killed, and this new threat is partly, at least, the reason for that. So in the north there's the emergence of this new religion, and people are worshipping what they call the one true God. And this is the Bright One, as kind of a goddess of light. And the leaders of the empire, known as the Lucent Empire, who worship this goddess, are really fanatics. And the guy at the top of that is the Falcon Prince, who is kind of an avatar for this one god, for this goddess of light. So the army of the Lucent Empire kind of replicates what Black Heron's army did previously, and they are taking over the continent, the world, however you see it, from north to south. And there is one kind of in the middle somewhere, there's a mountain pass and there's a town called Tarnbrook. Tarnbrook is seen as kind of the gateway to the south. If they can get through Tarnbrook, there'll be nothing left standing in the way and stopping the Lucent army from conquering the south and having free reign over all of those people, all of those settlements. So in steps Black Heron. Black Heron's been essentially off the radar for 40 years. Nobody knows where she's been, but she turns up in the story now, and she's going to make this last stand against the Lucent Empire at this mountain pass town of Tarnbrook. She gathers 6 of her generals from her 40 years ago army, brings them together to defend Tarnbrook. And that's largely the gist of the story without going into too much detail. There are many more twists and turns. Probably the biggest one in terms of the kind of Gathering of Heroes storyline is that these aren't actually heroes. So previously I mentioned that Black Heron was a demonologist. The other 6 generals that she brings to her cause are a necromancer, a former god of war, an orc warlord, a pirate queen, a vampire lord, and an alchemist who doesn't fight so much, but he basically creates potions and chemicals and is essentially involved in waging chemical warfare for the cause. The Lucent army, until you go into the details of it with executing those who won't convert and things like that, this is the sort of army that you would normally tend to associate with the side of good, because it's the goddess of the light and they're kind of the knights in shining armour who are very religious and kind of trying to destroy evil and let good prevail. So it's a bit of a twist on how you would normally tend to see this playing out, and that's one of the things that makes it stand out, I think, in this type of story. So in terms of the characters, one of the failings, I think, with this book is there are just too many different characters competing for page time. So we've got the 7 that make up the Maleficent 7, Black Heron and her generals. There's also then a few others who are fighting on this side. You've got a couple of people at Tarnbrook, whether they are elders or just townspeople who become involved in the militia that they set up to defend the town. You've got a couple of orcs that come along to the fight with the orc warlord. You've got a few pirates who are with the pirate queen. You've got the vampire lord brings along his kind of long-lived manservant. So there are plenty of people on the one side. We also see the Falcon Prince and some of his, not necessarily generals, but some of the leaders in his army. And that gives us a number of people to keep track of in what is essentially, it's a 400-page, I presume, standalone novel. So that can be a little bit to try and keep everything all in one place. And it's difficult to bring them all together, bearing in mind as well that in those previous retellings, in the Magnificent 7, in the 7 Samurai, we're dealing with 7 heroes of very similar ilk. We've got 7 samurai, we've got 7 gunslingers, and here we've got 7 people who are all very different. And in terms of comparison, it is very much more along the lines of an Avengers tale, for instance, where you've got this number of superheroes who all have their own unique abilities. They are all kind of overpowered almost. They could all have, and with the Avengers, they do all have pretty much their own movies. With a Maleficent 7, it's a similar story. They're all overpowered, they've all got different and unique powers, and they could all, I guess, have their own stories, their own books in this world. So it's a lot to try and weave together to make one coherent story. And for me, I think it kind of fails to do that. It's like it's trying a bit too hard to pull it all together, and it just makes an incomplete pattern for me. It doesn't quite pull it off. So we have individual focus on each of these. I'm just going to concentrate on the 7. We've got individual focus on each of the Maleficent 7, a couple more than others. So we deal with Black Heron, we deal with the necromancer who kind of starts us off. She's the one who goes around on Black Heron's behalf and starts to recruit the other generals to the cause. So we see those 2 probably a bit more than the others, and therefore we delve a little bit into their kind of backstory and their motivations a little bit more than the others. So one of the things with the characters that I did like is the Vampire Lord. Not necessarily as a character, he was kind of a bit hit and miss for me, but the actual Vampire Lord himself is really different. This one for me, he wasn't a normal kind of everyday vampire. So the Vampire Lord is kind of vampire and shapeshifter combined. He can choose his form at will, and whenever he gets angry or when he's going into battle, he'll kind of grow spikes and horns and fangs and claws and kind of go Hulk mode and rip his clothing as he expands to a massive size and goes on the assault. He's also able to travel in daylight. He kind of just wears a cloth over his eyes, and that that keeps the sunlight out of his eyes and seems to do the trick in terms of protecting him from the sunlight. We do see a couple of other kind of younger vampires because the vampire lord, as vampires are wont to, he does get a bit bitey now and then. And we see with some of them kind of the sun causing their skin to blister and so forth. So I'm not sure if the vampire lord doesn't do that because he's older and he's more powerful and it will take more to cause that to happen to him, or whether it's just that this cloth across the eyes is the key to it all and stops him from blistering if he can't physically see the sun or see it that well. Another key thing with the Vampire Lord is his powers of regeneration, so he can heal pretty much any wound, or if it's a wound that's not going to heal, sometimes you'll see him just rip off an arm or a leg, thinking it'll take more time to heal this than it will to just grow a new limb. So there's a little bit of creativity there. It's not just your bog standard vampire who's joining in the fight. So another one who I think is quite interesting is the former god of war. He's the former god of war because all of the people who worshipped him previously have died out, they were massacred, and because there's nobody left who believes in him as a god of war, kind of all of his godly powers have left him. So his powers of healing and greatness in battle, he still retains the skills and the abilities, but he's not the same type of warrior. And as a result, he's almost just like a regular human who's just got some really insane swordsman skills. In terms of the world, I think we don't really see a vast amount of detail. We spend obviously a large amount of the story in Tarnbrook because geographically speaking, that is the focus of the story. The first kind of 35% or so is the gathering of the heroes. So the necromancer is given a dossier basically to say where the other captains are and kind of what makes them tick, what she would need to say or do to get them to join the cause. And for that first portion of the book, we basically follow the necromancer going from one place to another and recruiting a different captain each time. So we see with each of these the individual locations that these captains are in and a little bit of the land around whilst they're travelling and so forth. Outside of that, we see a bit of the surroundings of Tarnbrook, things like the mountains and the hills and the pass itself as they're setting up fortifications and scouting ahead and so forth. And we see a tiny little bit here and there of the Lucent Empire. But there's not a vast amount of detail on most of this, and I guess that's because it's not really important to the story because the main point of focus, as I say, geographically speaking, is just this one town in the middle of it all. In terms of magic, there's not really a lot to see. We've got the reanimating of the dead from the necromancer, we've got the summoning of demons from Black Heron, the vampire lord, if you want to call his kind of art magic. I know with the Lucent, with the kind of the leaders at least of the Lucent Empire, they all have kind of abilities that are essentially God-given through this Bright One, and they kind of manifest odd little skills that you can see in battle as well. None of this is really described, it's all very soft magic, and it's just basically it happens and we don't know anything about it other than this person can do this, and we just see what we see when we see it, essentially. Now, the one thing that kind of bugged me with regards to the world building in this is the kind of the physical geography itself. There's no map, at least in the advanced review copy of the book, so I wasn't able to study this and to check this out for myself, but you've got this kind of the big thing, and the big kind of aspect of the story itself really is that Tarnbrook is the gateway to the south, and it is specifically stated in the book that, as I said earlier, the Lucent army will have free reign over the south if they can just get through Tarnbrook. Now, Tarnbrook is essentially it's a nothing of a town. There's no fortifications, there's no militia there at all. There's nothing that would stop an army until, of course, Black Heron and her captains rock up and start fortifying and start training up the townspeople as a militia to try and hold back the Lucent army. So it's all very kind of convenient that this would happen. There's a couple of bits in the story that give reasonings to this. I'm not going to go into in a non-spoiler review, but there are a couple of reasons why it's Tarnbrook that's chosen, but still it all comes across as a little bit convenient. Now, the main thing making this a convenience for me is you've got the general and her 6 captains, and one of those is a pirate queen. And her job, whilst everyone's defending Tarnbrook, her main job is to patrol the seas and make sure that the Lucent army doesn't land troops to the south and come upon Tarnbrook from behind. And this is where it doesn't quite work for me, because if you put in all of this relevance on Tarnbrook as being the gateway to the south, and you're saying that you have to get through Tarnbrook to be able to take control of the south, it seems a bit too easy to say that they would just be able to go around by boat and take over the south from that way. You know, they can land all of their troops there and completely ignore Tarnbrook if they so wanted to, and, you know, take over the south, and then once that's done, just pincer Tarnbrook in the middle, and that'll be the kind of the last outpost overwhelmed. So it's all kind of a bit convenient. It just doesn't quite work for me as a coherent story in that sense. So in terms of the storyline itself, there's not a vast amount to say. It's very much a linear story, and you kind of know what to expect a bit going into it if you've seen any of these previous Gathering of Heroes type tales. I thought it was a little bit slow starting because we see this necromancer going from place to place to place, descriptions of this new place that she comes upon, descriptions of the people there, or at least of the captain that she's gone to recruit from this place, a little scenario of what's happening, an argument on the one hand, a counter argument, she recruits this person, they go on to the next one, and we see that for each of these captains. So including when Black Heron recruited the necromancer for the cause, we see this 6 times. And after the first kind of 1 or 2, I thought, okay, now we're just going to rock up at Tarnbrook and she's going to have recruited the remaining captains. But instead, we see all of this happening. We see each of the 6, none of them are together, so it is 6 individual times. And I think it kind of really slows the story down. It gets a bit repetitive, and it could have been handled for me in a bit more of a kind of an inventive way, perhaps. And I guess that's where it differs looking at this on the page as it does on the screen, because on the screen you don't have all of that extra description, so you can do it in a lot shorter a space of time because you can actually see what's being described on the page, and that happens over the course of a few seconds as opposed to the course of a few pages. You might also find as well that some of these heroes that are being gathered are conveniently in the same place, whereas in the Maleficent 7 they are 6 separate locations, so you do have to go and find all 6 as opposed to just going to 3 or 4 places. So that's kind of one of the things that bugged me a little bit in just the way the story was set out. Another one is with the heroes themselves. I said earlier on, they are all overpowered, and it just takes a little bit too much to weave them all together into a coherent story. It's like the author's trying that little bit too hard to bring in these 7 completely different people. You might often see in this storyline kind of your 6 swords people or guns people on the walls, all fighting in the same kind of manner, all aiming in the same direction, whereas here you've got demons being summoned over there, the dead being raised over there, a couple of people fighting on the wall here. In the background you've got chemical warfare, bombs being lobbed, whatever it might be. Over there behind the scenes you've got the vampire lord who's maybe in the night going in and causing disruption behind the lines. So there's kind of a little bit too much going on, and it doesn't quite work as one story, where it might have worked a bit better if it was several different stories, not necessarily combined. The writing itself I thought was fine. There were no problems there. Other than the choices themselves with regards to how the first third of the book started out with the recruiting of the captains. Other than that, I thought The pace was pretty good. A lot of it is battle centered. From the 50% mark onwards, we are basically in battles for the most part, so that's always going to be a bit quicker paced anyway. So all of that I thought was fine. One odd choice which I picked up actually in my last video review, which kind of bugged me there. There's one of the characters, the alchemist is Jerrak Hayden, and for literally 70% of the time, I counted, he is referred to as Jerrak Hayden instead of just Jerrak. And it's kind of weird because none of the other characters have this and there seems no reason for it. So I don't know if this is something that I'm just kind of used to because I picked it up in the last book that I read and it's kind of stuck with me and I've noticed it here and it's just stuck out, or whether it's something that other people would find unusual as well. Overall though, I gave it a 3.5 stars. It was a good book, it wasn't brilliant, it could have been better, but it did the job that it set out to do. I just think that it could have done it a little bit better, maybe if it actually tried a little bit less hard than it actually did. But that's for Maleficent 7, so thanks very much for sticking around. I hope you found this informative. Give me a comment down below if you're looking at reading this book and let me know what your thoughts are. But for now, take care of yourselves, read some good books, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye bye.